Let's get some perspective now from the Premier of New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, joining us with perspective on that provincial story. Premier, thanks very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Good morning, Thomas. Nice to be here.
So obviously in a story like that, we get a sense of what's happening in certain pockets of the country. I think a lot of people would say in the case of your province, things have, the progress has been pretty encouraging. How have you been controlling or fighting the spread?
Well, John, we continue to monitor our borders very closely and the movement to and from. Even with the Atlantic bubble opened up, we've tracked people coming in and out so we can contact them if needed. We have the ability to zoom in an area and if we have an outbreak of some sort. Our cases have all been travel related, and we've been able thus far to make the connections and limit that exposure. So, you know, as the discussion goes about opening up with the rest of Canada and with this current rise in the outbreaks with our neighboring provinces, it's a concern for us, and it's like, do we go the next step and when? And I've been working with my colleagues in Atlantic Canada to decide on that next move.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that. Has anything specifically started to change in your sentiment over the last couple of days? I know obviously there's been a big focus on portions of the border with Quebec reopening, so maybe you can give us an update on that front.
Sure, and we have moved there. We had meetings yesterday with our COVID cabinet group and with our regular cabinet, and made a decision there. And I've spoken to the mayor and the chiefs in the area about opening up on the border, northern New Brunswick border, and with Quebec, so those communities can interface back and forth with business as normal in the new COVID world. So that's going to happen on August 1st. And the idea is that we do have a way to trace, they can apply online. We have postal codes that we can track, so we know where people will live, and they could come back and forth on day passes that would allow the communities to once again resume their activities and yet still be cognizant that not far away in the big cities like Montreal, there are concerns and cases are currently on the rise. And so we're trying to balance this with keeping people safe. We see, here in New Brunswick, not like what we're seeing across the country, where when the weather's warm, people are gathering and getting outside, and the social distancing is becoming a challenge. So our best protection is us to be, limit exposure as much as possible to what might be a traveler coming in from one of the big cities and causing an outbreak here in New Brunswick.
You talked about the Atlantic bubble. I think a lot of people looked at that as an interesting case study. What would you say? What are your biggest learnings from going through that experience to date?
Well, it has worked well. Today we've had we knew that the more you open up, you're going to get into some issues. And we've seen that. I mean, we've seen a little rise here that was traveling. We've seen a rise in PEI. And so we knew that's what to expect. But as we go forward, I think it's good that we're working together, and I know we'll have different views maybe on just how fast one province opens up with another. But thus far, we've stayed to kind of a program that we've moved together on, and as we change, if one province goes a little faster than another, we'll just want to know that we can protect our individual borders if the public aren't quite in the same position, and we've had great cooperation from all, I would say, all of our premiers across the country, but in the Atlantic bubble with our Atlantic premiers, and looking at and being cognizant of each other's particular concerns. So thus, it's working well.
And then just bigger picture on borders, because obviously the U.S. border is something that you have to think about as well, and we continue to watch the uncertainty south of the border. What has been your dialogue with Ottawa on that tense issue? I would say obviously there's some in the business community that would like to see that open up, but obviously we continue to watch the rising case count in the United States.
Yes, and there's not much appetite. Different provinces would have different views, maybe depending on their particular activity. back and forth across the border. But overall, the federal government has been clear on this, and I certainly support the position that the U.S. border remains closed for routine traffic. And I say routine, I'm more or less talking about social traffic, because economic traffic has continued to move from the very beginning, and that will continue. So we're not holding back on commercial activities because we need to keep that moving. But as far as opening up for just general traffic, general visits, I don't see that happening, nor would I be promoting that for many weeks or months to come. At this point, I believe the federal government is moved it out to the end of August, and but there isn't any real appetite to do anything at this point at all in that regard. It's unfortunate. Many people have properties here in the Maritimes or in other parts of Canada that live in the U.S., and we'd like to be able to work through that, but it is such the situation there that we just can't take a risk at this stage that we can't find appropriate methods to control.
So you would not be surprised if those restrictions continued into the fall, in other words?
Oh, no, I would not. No, if it continues like we see right today, no, I would not at all.
And then you mentioned, obviously, there are Americans that have properties in your province, but also just these are, generally speaking, big months for New Brunswick, the tourism and travel industry. So how have you been navigating that? I mean, how are you dealing with the local business story when you can't have that traditional travel at the border?
Well, interestingly, we're seeing a great uptake in local travel, like in terms of people in the bubble moving, but people in New Brunswick that it's actually having a staycation moving around the province. We have a program in place that we actually provide an incentive for people that would go and stay somewhere overnight, so an overnight combination. So basically, it's a rebate program that would help them to consider staying in New Brunswick, but having accommodations, and because we know that industry is hurting, the service sector in terms of restaurants, in terms of hotels or motels or campgrounds. So we've encouraged that, and we've provided a program to encourage it, and we've seen a great uptake in that. So this is a summer that I say like never before that we all need to rediscover New Brunswick. And so far, I would say there's indication that is indeed happening.
Premier Higgs, the story of reopening restaurants and retail shops, we sort of continue to watch that worldwide, quite frankly, just to sort of see what the experiences are like. Can you tell us about what has been reopening in your province and how that is going?
Well, actually, we are essentially fully open. We've said here are the guidelines around the public health. And anyone who can meet those guidelines in their facility are allowed to open and get back in business. And we are seeing that. I think we were leading the country in relation to businesses being open and in some cases restricted because of the size or because of what they would normally have for customers. They just have to measure that and monitor it a little more closely. So, in all areas, we've said, let's get back in business, but let's recognize the health standards. And that makes it even more important to think about our borders. Because, you can move around within the quarters, respecting the health standards, but recognizing that the more you open, the more risk there is. But if you have, you don't have any real outbreak or caseload here, and I think we have 3 at this point, active cases, it's easier and the risk is less. But that doesn't mean that it's not there. It doesn't mean that there could be a problem. So we need to follow the health standards at the same time, and in doing so, we're hopeful we can continue on the path we've been on for the last many months.
Finally, Premier, before we let you go, obviously we've watched the federal government earmark billions of dollars for provinces, including your own, in terms of some of the emergency aid. Can you just give us a sense on the roadmap to that money and getting that money and how that money will largely be used?
Well, it was certainly an interesting process through the discussion with all my colleagues across the country and the Prime Minister's office, and it basically there was a lot of interest in having flexibility in how the money would be used, flexibility that made sense for any particular province and for the conditions they were in. In our case, looking at certainly the health concerns, it's an ongoing challenge which we'll address again in the fall about the health transfers, because the routine health transfers are only about 20% of our total health care costs. And that was always a 50% item back when it originally started. So there's room there, and every government over the past number of years, I'm talking federal governments, have not lived up to that program where we get back up to the original formula of 50%. It's going to be a big issue going forward in the fall with our federal meetings that are planned. In our case, priorities having protective equipment available, which we feel we're in good position there for the concern of a next outbreak.